The sun was setting over Vatican City, casting a golden glow across the marble courtyards. Bells echoed softly through the ancient walls, calling the faithful to evening prayers. Inside the grand hall of the Apostolic Palace, rows of candles flickered, lighting up the high ceilings covered in centuries-old art. The Vatican had seen many gatherings, but this night was different. It was not for politics nor for ceremony, it was for music. The world's most talented musicians and guests had been invited to perform in front of Pope Leo XIV himself, a man known for his kindness, intelligence, and calm spirit. The audience was filled with nobles, scholars, and artists from every corner of Europe. Their clothes shimmered under the candlelight, and the air carried a quiet tension of expectation. Among them stood a famous pianist, celebrated for his brilliance but also for his arrogance. He was a man who believed that no one, not even kings or priests, could understand music as deeply as he did. People admired his talent, but few admired his attitude. As the guests took their seats, the pianist stood near the stage, running his fingers over the piano keys as if testing them. His expression was confident, almost proud. Leaning toward a fellow musician, he whispered with a grin, "I wonder if His Holiness knows the difference between a sonata and a sermon." His tone carried a hint of mockery, and the nearby guests exchanged uneasy glances. The Vatican guards at the doors stood still, pretending not to hear, though one of them frowned slightly. The Pope entered the room quietly, surrounded by a few attendants. He wore his simple white robe, and his face carried a gentle, welcoming smile. Despite the grandeur around him, there was something humble in his presence. As he walked down the aisle, everyone rose in respect. The pianist gave a short, polite bow, but could not hide the smirk still resting on his lips. The Pope greeted several guests before taking his seat. When his eyes met the pianist's, he nodded kindly. "I've heard of your music," he said softly. "They say your hands speak a language only the soul can understand." The pianist gave a small laugh, not out of gratitude, but out of pride. "I try to let my art speak for itself, Your Holiness," he said, "though I fear the Church might find it too worldly for their ears." The Pope didn't respond with offense. Instead, he smiled faintly and replied, "All music, when born from truth, reaches heaven before it reaches any audience." His words were calm and sincere, but they seemed to unsettle the pianist, who had not expected such grace. As the concert began, the first few performers took their turns. A violinist played a delicate hymn, her bow gliding across the strings with reverence. A choir followed, their voices rising in harmony that filled the hall like light itself. The audience listened with deep appreciation, and the Pope closed his eyes for a moment as if in prayer. Then came the pianist's turn. The murmurs stopped. Everyone knew they were about to witness a performance of extraordinary skill. He sat down at the piano, adjusted his cuffs, and placed his hands on the keys. For a moment there was silence, then his fingers began to move. The first note struck the air like thunder. His music was fast, powerful, and dramatic. Each chord came with precision, every note sharp as glass. The audience was amazed by the speed of his hands, the control he had over every sound. Yet as the music grew louder, something in it felt cold. It was brilliant but emotionless, like a storm without rain. The pianist played as if he was proving something, not sharing something. He ended with a loud, crashing final chord and lifted his hands triumphantly. The room broke into applause, but it was not the warm, joyful kind. It was polite, respectful, yet distant. The Pope clapped softly, his face thoughtful. He nodded once, but there was no great expression of awe. The pianist noticed this. His pride wavered. He had expected gasps, perhaps even tears of admiration. Instead, he saw calm faces and quiet appreciation. As he stood, he forced a smile, hiding his irritation. He bowed to the Pope and said lightly, "I hope my performance was not too earthly for Your Holiness." The Pope rose from his chair. His expression remained gentle, almost serene. "It was impressive," he said kindly. "Your talent is truly a gift." He paused for a moment before adding, "Yet sometimes the simplest melody can carry more light than the loudest symphony." The words hung in the air like a soft wind. The pianist blinked, unsure how to respond. He gave a short laugh and said, "Perhaps, but art is also about mastery, is it not?" The Pope smiled again, his eyes glimmering. "Mastery of the heart, yes," he said. Then, to everyone's surprise, he stepped toward the piano. A quiet murmur spread across the room. No one had ever seen a pope touch a musical instrument during such an event. The pianist looked amused, crossing his arms as if waiting for a performance to mock. "Your Holiness," he said with a bow, "please show us your mastery." The Pope did not respond to the sarcasm. He simply sat down at the piano bench, his robe flowing softly around him. He rested his hands on the keys, and for a moment he didn't play. He just breathed in, eyes half closed as though listening to something unseen. Then his fingers began to move, slowly, gently. The notes that came out were simple, almost fragile. But they carried something deep. There was warmth in them, something that touched every person in the room. The melody was not complicated, it was a quiet prayer in the form of sound. Each note seemed to tell a story of peace, faith, and love. The pianist's smirk faded. He leaned slightly forward, drawn in despite himself. The music continued, soft but full of meaning. It was as though every key the Pope touched carried a blessing. The hall grew so quiet that one could hear the faint flicker of candle flames. The Pope didn't play long, just a short piece, something that seemed to come from his heart rather than his mind. When he stopped, he lifted his hand slowly, letting the final note fade into silence. No one clapped. They couldn't. The moment felt sacred, too real to interrupt with applause. Even the proud pianist felt a lump in his throat. He didn't understand how something so simple could feel so powerful. The Pope stood up and looked at the pianist. "Music," he said softly, "is not a competition of skill. It is a conversation with the soul." The pianist lowered his gaze, unable to meet the Pope's eyes. The room remained silent for a long time, and when applause finally came, it wasn't just for the music, it was for the meaning behind it. As the guests began to leave, whispers filled the hall. Some spoke of how they felt something divine in those few notes. Others said they saw the famous pianist's pride vanish before their eyes. But no one could quite explain the feeling that had settled in their hearts. The pianist stood alone by the piano, staring at the keys. For the first time in many years, he felt small, not in a shameful way, but in a humble, human way. He realized that what he had witnessed was not about skill or fame. It was about connection, the kind that cannot be practiced, only felt. As Pope Leo XIII passed by him, he placed a gentle hand on the pianist's shoulder and said quietly, "The music of heaven is made by hearts that listen." Then he walked away, leaving the pianist standing there in silence, his pride replaced with something deeper, respect, perhaps even faith. That night, as the moon rose above the Vatican, the pianist sat alone at the same piano. He played not to impress, but to feel. And for the first time, the notes he played carried warmth. They sounded different, alive, like the echo of a lesson he would never forget. The morning after the performance at the Vatican began quietly. The sun rose over the domes and stone courtyards, painting the sky in soft colors. The city was still, but inside the palace walls, whispers about the previous night had already started spreading. Servants, guards, and guests all spoke about how the Pope had played the piano, not with skill like a trained musician, but with something deeper, something that had touched everyone's heart. The pianist woke up in his chamber feeling restless. The melody that Pope Leo XIV had played still echoed in his mind. He couldn't forget it, no matter how hard he tried. It wasn't complex or technical, yet it stayed with him, as if the notes had left a mark somewhere deep inside. He sat by the window, staring out at the city rooftops, trying to make sense of what had happened. For years he had believed that mastery was everything, that a true artist's worth was measured by how perfectly he could play, how much control he had over his art. But what he had seen last night challenged everything he thought he knew. He tried to convince himself it was nothing. "It was just a moment," he muttered. People were emotional because it was the Pope. Yet deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The feeling he had when the Pope played, that sudden stillness in his chest, that warmth that rose unexpectedly, it wasn't admiration. It was awe. Later that day, he was invited to breakfast with several cardinals and guests. The atmosphere was light. People were chatting over fresh bread, fruit, and coffee. But the conversation soon turned to the performance. One of the older guests said with a smile, "I've heard 1,000 concerts in my life, but none like that." The Holy Father played as if every note was a prayer. Another added, "The pianist was extraordinary, of course, but when the Pope played, something changed in the air. It felt like peace." The pianist listened quietly, forcing a polite smile, though each word made him uncomfortable. It wasn't jealousy this time, it was confusion. He had spent his whole life chasing admiration. Last night he received it, yet it didn't satisfy him. The Pope, on the other hand, played a few humble notes and moved the entire room. When the Pope entered the hall that morning, everyone stood. He walked slowly, smiling, and greeted those present with gentle words. When his eyes met the pianist's, he gave a small nod. "Did you sleep well, my friend?" The pianist hesitated before answering. "Not exactly, Your Holiness. I had a lot to think about." The Pope sat beside him and said softly, "That is good. A restless mind is often a growing one." The pianist tried to laugh, but his voice trembled slightly. "I must admit, Your Holiness, I've been thinking about last night. I can't understand how such a simple tune could carry such weight. It wasn't about skill, was it?" The Pope looked at him with calm eyes. "No, it wasn't," he said gently. "Music, when played with pride, speaks to the mind. But when played with truth, it speaks to the soul." The pianist lowered his gaze, feeling a strange mix of humility and relief. "Then I've been speaking to the wrong part of people all my life," he said quietly. The Pope smiled. "Perhaps, but it is never too late to learn another language." They sat in silence for a moment, sipping coffee. The pianist wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. For years he had filled concert halls with thunderous applause, yet now he realized how empty those moments had been. Later in the afternoon, the pianist decided to walk through the Vatican gardens. The air was warm, and the sound of fountains echoed gently among the olive trees. He passed by priests and scholars reading quietly under the shade. He thought about how peaceful everything seemed here, how different it was from the noise of theaters and stages where he had spent most of his life. As he walked, he saw the Pope sitting on a bench near a small pond, surrounded by a few children from the nearby choir school. They were laughing as the Pope spoke to them, telling a story about music and faith. He watched how easily people connected with him. There was no distance, no sense of authority being imposed, and only kindness. When the children left, the pianist approached. "Your Holiness," he said softly. The Pope turned with his usual warm smile. "Ah, the artist who keeps thinking," he said kindly. "Come sit." The pianist sat beside him. "I wanted to ask," he began, "how did you learn to play like that? I've spent decades studying, and yet you played with such emotion, such truth." The Pope looked toward the pond for a moment before answering. "I had a teacher once," he said. "He was not a musician, but a gardener. He told me something I never forgot. He said that when he plants flowers, he does not do it to impress anyone. He does it because he loves the act of giving life. That is how music should be played. Not to show what you can do, but to share what you feel." The pianist listened in silence. The simplicity of the answer struck him deeply. It wasn't about fame or applause or even perfection. It was about honesty, and about giving something real to others. The Pope continued, "There is beauty in precision, yes? But beauty without heart fades quickly. The world remembers music that touches, not music that dazzles." The pianist nodded slowly, understanding more with each word. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to defend his art or his pride. Instead, he felt grateful to be reminded of what he had forgotten long ago. That evening, as the sky darkened and the Vatican bells rang again, the pianist sat once more at the grand piano in the hall. No audience this time, no applause waiting at the end, only the dim light of candles and the quiet echo of his thoughts. He began to play, softly, hesitantly at first. The melody that came out was not perfect. There were small mistakes, uneven tones, but it was honest. It was his heart speaking, not his ego, as he played. He remembered the Pope's words. Music is a conversation with the soul. For the first time, he felt he was finally listening. The next day, before leaving the Vatican, the pianist met the Pope again. "Your Holiness," he said, "I want to thank you. I came here to perform, but I'm leaving with something far greater." The Pope nodded kindly. "Then my heart is glad," he said. "Wherever you go next, let your hands remember what your soul has learned." The pianist bowed deeply. "I will," he said quietly. When he left the Vatican, he didn't rush back to fame or applause. He stayed silent for days, reflecting on the lesson he had been given. Something inside him had changed. A kind of peace had replaced the pride that once ruled him. Weeks later, when he returned to perform in Paris, people noticed something different about him. His playing was no longer a display of power. It was warm, sincere, and deeply human. Listeners who once admired his skill now wept during his performances, feeling something real in every note. He never spoke publicly about what happened in the Vatican, but those who knew him well said that from that night on, his music carried something divine, as if a piece of the Pope's melody still lived within him. And though he continued to perform around the world, he often thought back to that moment in the Grand Hall, the night when the Pope's humble tune silenced his pride and awakened his soul. The evening sky over Rome was calm and filled with a soft orange glow. The famous pianist who had left the Vatican a few days ago now found himself walking through quiet streets lost in thought. His time with Pope Leo XIV had changed something inside him, something he could not yet explain. The world outside was still the same. The noise of carriages, the chatter of people, the scent of bread from nearby bakeries. But he no longer saw it the same way. Every sound, every detail seemed richer, more meaningful. He began to notice things he had ignored before. The laughter of children, the rhythm of footsteps, even the song of a bird seemed like a small piece of music. He returned to his small apartment overlooking the Tiber River. For years, the room had been filled with trophies, portraits, and framed reviews from newspapers praising his talent. But as he looked around now, he felt strangely distant from all of it. Those things had once given him pride. Now they felt empty. He sat by the window with his piano beside him, the same piano that had carried him to fame. For the first time, he didn't want to show off. He wanted to feel something honest. He placed his hands gently on the keys and began to play. At first, the notes were uncertain, wandering like a lost thought. Then they grew steadier, softer, warmer. He played not for an audience, but for himself. The melody he created wasn't perfect, but it felt alive. As he played, tears slowly filled his eyes. He didn't know why. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was the realization that he had spent half his life chasing something that could never fill him. The next morning, he decided to visit an old friend, a violinist who lived in the countryside outside Rome. They had performed together many times before, but years of ego and competition had separated them. He had often looked down on this friend for choosing a simpler life, away from fame and big stages. Now he wanted to see him again, to talk about music the way they used to when they were young and full of dreams. The journey took a few hours. When he arrived, the countryside was quiet and green. His old friend's home was small, surrounded by olive trees and the sound of wind in the branches. The violinist was surprised to see him at the door. "It's been years," the friend said with a warm smile. "I thought you had forgotten us simple musicians." The pianist shook his head. "Maybe I had forgotten myself," he said softly. "But I'm here now." They spent the day together, sitting outside under the shade of an old tree. The violinist's wife brought them bread, cheese, and grapes. They laughed and talked for hours. The pianist told him everything about the Vatican, about how he had mocked the Pope and how the Pope's simple tune had changed his heart. The friend listened carefully, never judging, only nodding with quiet understanding. At sunset, the violinist said, "You've learned something most people never do, that music is not about showing who you are, but about sharing what you feel. I'm glad you found that truth." That night, they played together like they used to in their youth. The violin's voice blended softly with the piano's notes. There were no mistakes that mattered, no competition, no pride, just friendship and sound echoing into the quiet hills. When they finished, the pianist felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. A few weeks later, he received a letter from the Vatican. It was sealed with the Pope's mark. He opened it carefully. Inside, the message was simple. "My friend, I hope your hands continue to speak with honesty. There is a concert soon here in the Vatican. I would like you to play again, not for an audience, but for God." The pianist sat for a long time staring at the letter. The idea of returning there made his heart race. The last time he stood in that hall, his pride had been exposed and broken. Now the thought of playing again, this time with humility, both frightened and excited him. He decided to accept. When the day arrived, he traveled back to the Vatican. This time he wasn't dressed in flashy clothes or wearing his usual proud expression. He walked quietly, greeting people kindly. The same grand hall that once made him feel powerful now made him feel small, but in a comforting way. The Pope greeted him warmly. "I'm happy you came back," he said. "Are you ready to play?" The pianist smiled faintly. "I don't know if I'm ready," he said honestly. "But I'll try." The Pope nodded. That's all that is ever asked of us, to try with sincerity. The pianist took his seat at the piano. There was no grand audience this time, only a few priests, nuns, and children from the choir. The silence felt soft, almost like a blanket. He closed his eyes and began to play. The music was slow and full of emotion, like a river moving gently through the valley of his heart. Every note told a piece of his journey, the pride, the fall, the awakening. As he played, the Pope listened quietly, hands folded. The children sat on the floor, their faces calm and curious. When the piece ended, the hall was silent again, just as before. But this time the silence was peaceful. The pianist looked at the Pope, waiting for his reaction. The Pope smiled. "Now," he said softly, "you have found your true sound." The pianist felt tears in his eyes again, but he didn't try to hide them. He bowed his head and whispered, "Thank you." After the performance, the Pope invited him to walk through the gardens once more. The air smelled of jasmine and fresh rain. They walked side by side in silence for a while. Then the Pope said, "Do you see how music can heal? It can turn pride into peace and loneliness into love. You've done more than perform. You've transformed." The pianist nodded. "I think I understand now. I used to believe music was about being the best, but now I see it's about being real." The Pope stopped walking and looked at him kindly. "The world needs truth more than perfection," he said. "When you play with truth, even silence becomes part of the song." Those words stayed in the pianist's heart forever. When he left the Vatican that evening, he felt lighter, as if something heavy had finally been lifted. He returned to his apartment in Rome and looked again at the trophies on his shelf. This time he didn't feel proud or embarrassed, he simply felt thankful. Those awards were part of his story, but they no longer defined him. Over the next few months he continued to perform around Europe. But his performances were different now. He didn't bow dramatically, didn't seek praise or competition. He spoke to the audience before each concert, sharing a little about what he had learned. That music was not about perfection, but about connection. His honesty touched people. Many came to hear him not just for his skill, but for the feeling his music gave them. At one concert, after finishing his piece, a young student approached him and asked, "Master, how can I play like you?" The pianist smiled and replied, "Play with your heart, not with your pride. When you stop trying to impress, your music will finally begin to speak." The student nodded, not fully understanding yet, but the words would one day return to him, just as the Popes had returned to the pianist. Every time the pianist sat at his piano after that, he would remember the quiet Vatican hall, the sound of the Pope's gentle melody, and the lesson that had changed his life. He no longer played to prove anything. He played to feel, to give, to heal. And somewhere in the world, in a grand room of marble and gold, Pope Leo XIV often thought of him too, the proud artist who learned the language of humility and whose music had found its way from pride to peace. The months that followed were filled with quiet transformation for the pianist. The man who once lived only for applause had begun to find peace in simplicity. Each morning he rose early, opened his windows to the sound of birds and city bells, and played soft melodies just for himself. He no longer cared how perfect his performance sounded. He cared only that each note carried feeling. His neighbors often stopped outside his window to listen. They said the music had changed. It felt warmer, like sunlight after rain. Some said it made them smile without knowing why. Others said it made them remember things they hadn't thought of in years. For the pianist, that was enough. He had finally understood what Pope Leo XIV meant when he said, "Music that comes from truth speaks without words." But life has a way of testing lessons we think we've already learned. One evening, the pianist received a letter from a royal court in Vienna. They were organizing a grand concert, one of the most prestigious in Europe, and they wanted him to perform. The invitation was written in elegant handwriting, sealed with the royal emblem. It promised a generous reward and the presence of the most important figures in art and politics. For a long time, he stared at the letter. A part of him felt proud. After all, he had dreamed of performing at that stage since his youth. But another part of him felt uneasy. He had changed, and he feared that stepping back into the old world of fame and vanity might awaken the arrogance he had left behind. That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked through the empty streets, remembering the Pope's gentle face, the quiet of the Vatican hall, and the way those few simple notes had silenced his pride. Finally, as the first light of dawn touched the rooftops, he decided he would go to Vienna, but not as the man he once was. He would play differently this time. He would play with honesty. Weeks later, he arrived in Vienna. The city was alive with excitement. Posters with his name were everywhere. The newspapers called him the master of emotion, and audiences lined up to see him. It all felt strange. He was grateful, yet he no longer cared for the praise. What mattered to him was what he could give through his music. The night of the concert came. The Royal Theatre was filled to the last seat. The chandeliers glittered above, and people whispered eagerly, waiting for him to appear. When he stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted in applause. But instead of bowing with grandeur as he used to, he gave a small nod and sat quietly at the piano. He took a deep breath and began to play. The music that flowed from his hands was simple, like a quiet river. There were no dazzling runs or dramatic flourishes, only tenderness. Every note carried warmth, every pause held meaning. The audience, expecting something loud and grand, slowly fell into silence. They felt something they hadn't expected: peace. Halfway through the performance, he stopped suddenly. He looked at the crowd and smiled softly. "I was once a man who played to be admired," he said. "But now I play to remind us all that beauty isn't in perfection, it's in truth." Then he began to play again, this time a melody inspired by the Pope's tune, the one that had changed him. The moment he struck the first note, a hush fell over the hall. The sound was so gentle that even the faint creak of a chair could be heard. As he played, tears rolled down his cheeks, and many in the audience wiped their own eyes. They weren't listening to a performance. They were witnessing a confession through music. When the last note faded, there was silence. It stretched for several seconds before the entire hall erupted in applause. Not the loud, boastful kind, but the kind that comes from deep emotion. People stood clapping slowly as if afraid to break the spell. Some whispered prayers. Others simply smiled through tears. After the concert, the pianist quietly left the stage. He didn't stay for praise or interviews. He walked out into the cool night air alone. The city lights sparkled around him, but he felt calm. For the first time, he knew he had truly given something real. The next morning, he received another letter from the Vatican. It was short, written in the Pope's own handwriting. "I heard the wind carried your melody all the way to Rome. You have learned to speak through silence. The world now hears not just your hands, but your heart." He held the letter to his chest and smiled. After Vienna, his reputation changed. Critics called his style divine simplicity. Students came from distant countries to learn from him, expecting to hear secrets of technique and fame. But when they arrived, he gave them something else entirely. "Close your eyes," he would tell them. "Play one note, just one. Don't worry about how it sounds, feel it." At first, the students didn't understand. They wanted complex lessons, not quiet reflection. But slowly they began to realize what he meant. Some cried during practice. Others smiled without knowing why. One young man once asked, "Master, how do I make the audience love my music?" The pianist looked at him kindly and said, "Stop trying to make them love you. Love them through your music instead." Years passed. The pianist grew older, but his heart stayed gentle. He performed less and spent more time teaching and writing. Sometimes he would walk to a small chapel near his home, sit quietly in the back pew and listen to the choir rehearse. The sound of their voices reminded him of that night in the Vatican, the night that changed everything. One winter evening, he received a visitor. It was a messenger from Rome, carrying a letter with the Pope's seal. The letter said that Pope Leo XIV had fallen ill and might not have much time left. The pianist's hands trembled as he read it. Without hesitation, he packed his things and left for the Vatican the next morning. When he arrived, the guards led him to the Pope's private room. The air was filled with the faint smell of candles and incense. The Pope lay resting, his face pale but peaceful. When he saw the pianist, he smiled weakly. "My friend," the Pope said, his voice soft. "You came." "Yes, Your Holiness," the pianist replied, kneeling beside him. "I came to thank you. Everything I am now, I owe to you." The Pope reached out a frail hand and placed it gently over the pianist's. "No," he whispered. "You found your own light. I only showed you where to look." They sat in silence for a moment. The Pope then asked, "Would you play for me once more?" The pianist hesitated, tears filling his eyes. "Of course," he said softly. He turned toward the small piano in the corner of the room and began to play. It was the same melody the Pope had played years ago, the same humble, heartfelt tune that had opened his soul. The notes filled the quiet chamber, soft and sacred. The Pope closed his eyes, a faint smile on his lips. When the song ended, he whispered, "Beautiful. It's more beautiful now." The pianist turned to him, but the Pope had already drifted into peaceful rest. The room was silent except for the flicker of candlelight. The pianist bowed his head and wept quietly, not from sorrow alone, but from gratitude. After the Pope's passing, people all over the world mourned him. The pianist attended the ceremony, but he stayed in the back, not wanting attention. When the choir sang, he closed his eyes and listened, remembering every lesson, every word the Pope had spoken. In the years that followed, the pianist carried the Pope's message everywhere he went. His concerts became gatherings of peace rather than performances. People came not just to hear music, but to feel something deeper, to be reminded of kindness, humility, and love. And even as his fame grew, he never let pride return. Whenever someone asked what had inspired him most, he would simply smile and say, "A man of faith once taught me that the truest music isn't played for applause, it's played for the heart." And somewhere, in the quiet halls of the Vatican, the echo of their melodies still lingered. Two souls, united through sound, reminding the world that truth and humility can turn even the simplest tune into something eternal. Years had passed since that unforgettable night in the Vatican and the quiet farewell to Pope Leo XV. The pianist had grown older, though his spirit remained calm and steady, like the last glow of sunset that lingers long after the sun has dipped below the horizon. His hair had turned white, and his hands, though slightly trembling now, still carried grace when they touched the piano keys. He no longer sought fame or recognition, but somehow his name had become a symbol of hope and peace across nations. He lived in a small countryside house surrounded by tall cypress trees and a clear stream that flowed nearby. The walls of his home were filled with memories, photos of concerts, letters from students, and a few old notes written by the Pope himself. But among all those memories, the piano stood at the center, polished and cared for as though it were alive. Every morning before breakfast, he would sit before it, close his eyes, and play a gentle melody. The people of the nearby village often gathered outside his window to listen. Sometimes he saw children sitting quietly on the grass, holding their breath so as not to miss a single note. He often smiled at them and said softly, "Music is a prayer that doesn't need words." But even in his peaceful days, a thought began to stir in his mind, something unfinished. He felt that his story and the lesson he had learned from the Pope needed to be shared more widely, not for fame, but for the sake of passing on the light that had once been given to him. He wanted to compose one final piece, something that would speak not only to musicians, but to every person who had ever lost their way and found it again. He called it the Song of Silence. He worked on it slowly, without rush. Each note he wrote carried meaning, shaped by his years of struggle, pride, and redemption. Sometimes he would stop writing for days, walking through the forest paths, listening to the wind, and watching how sunlight moved through the leaves. He wanted the music to feel as if it were alive, soft, human, and honest. One day, as he sat by the stream, he was joined by a young woman carrying a violin. She introduced herself as a student from a faraway country who had come to learn from him. Her eyes were bright with admiration and curiosity. "I have listened to your music all my life," she said shyly. "It changed how I see the world. Will you teach me how to play like you?" He smiled gently. "You cannot play like me," he said. "And that's good. You must play like yourself." For the next few months, she became his companion. She helped around the house, listened quietly when he spoke, and practiced the violin in the evenings while he wrote. Their days followed a peaceful rhythm: morning practice, afternoon walks, and long conversations about life and art. The pianist began to see in her the same hunger for truth that he had once felt. One evening, as they sat outside watching the stars, she asked, "Do you ever regret leaving the world of fame behind?" He thought for a long time before answering. "There was a time when I believed applause was love," he said. "But applause fades. What stays is the sound that touches another heart." The Pope helped me understand that. He taught me that the soul of music is found in humility. The young woman nodded silently. The wind rustled the trees and the sound of distant bells floated through the night. When the Song of Silence was finally finished, the pianist decided to perform it just once, in the Vatican where his transformation had begun. He wrote to the church explaining his wish to dedicate the composition to the memory of Pope Leo XIV. The reply came swiftly, filled with warmth and gratitude. The Vatican agreed to host the performance and invited him to play in the same hall where the Pope had once played before him. The news spread quickly. People from all over the world began to travel to Rome to witness what many were calling the return of the humble maestro. But the pianist wasn't thinking of crowds. He was thinking only of honoring the man who had changed his heart. The night before the concert, he visited the Vatican chapel alone. The marble floor echoed with each step as he walked to the front and knelt before the altar. He placed a single white rose beside a small plaque that bore the Pope's name. "Thank you," he whispered. "You showed me what music truly is. Tomorrow I will play for you." When the day came, the Vatican hall was filled with dignitaries, musicians, and people of faith. Candles glowed softly, casting golden light on the walls. The pianist, dressed in a simple black suit, walked slowly to the piano. The audience rose in respect, but he gently motioned for them to sit. For a long moment, he didn't play. He simply sat, hands resting on his lap, eyes closed. The hall was utterly silent. Then, with a deep breath, he began. The first notes were soft and distant, like a whisper carried by the wind. The melody rose slowly, almost fragile at first, then grew warmer as if the piano itself were speaking. Every chord felt like a memory, some joyful, some sorrowful, but all deeply human. As the piece unfolded, the young woman who had studied with him watched from the front row, tears streaming down her face. She understood now what he meant by truth in music. The audience, too, was motionless, afraid to even breathe. The melody seemed to fill the entire hall with light, and in that light everyone felt something different: peace, forgiveness, hope. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was powerful. For several seconds no one moved. Then slowly people began to rise to their feet. The applause was thunderous, but the pianist simply bowed his head and smiled faintly. He didn't need words. The music had said everything. After the concert, he was approached by a cardinal who had been close to Pope Leo XIII. The old man placed a hand on the pianist's shoulder and said softly, "His Holiness would have been proud. You have completed the circle." The pianist nodded, his eyes glistening. "It was never mine to complete," he said. "It was his message that lived through me." Later that night, back in his room, he sat quietly by the window, looking out at the glowing dome of St. Peter's Basilica. The air smelled of rain, and the streets below shimmered with reflections of lanterns. He thought about his life, the pride, the fall, the lessons, and the grace that had come after. A deep calm filled his heart. He turned to the young woman who had come to bid him good night. "Tomorrow," he said, "the world will go back to its noise. But promise me something, don't let the silence leave you." She nodded, holding back tears. "I promise." He smiled and looked out the window again. "Good," he said softly. "Because silence is where music is born." That night, as the city slept, he played one last time. No audience, no applause, just him and the piano. The melody was tender and slow, filled with gratitude. He played until his hands grew tired and his eyes heavy. Finally, he closed the lid of the piano, whispered a quiet prayer, and went to rest. In the morning, when the young woman came to wake him, she found him sitting peacefully in his chair, his face calm, his hands folded over a sheet of music. On it were the final notes of the Song of Silence, written in his delicate handwriting. She sat beside him, unable to hold back her tears. But as she looked at the paper, she realized something. The melody was unfinished. The last measure was open, waiting for another note. She smiled through her sadness, understanding what he meant. The song was not meant to end with him. It was meant to continue through others. That day, the bells of the Vatican rang softly over the city. People gathered to honor the great pianist who had once been ridiculed but ended up touching the soul of the world. His story spread everywhere, not as a tale of fame, but of humility, transformation, and love. And in the quiet corners of the world, people began to play his music, some perfectly, others imperfectly, but always with feeling. Because they understood now, just as he had, that true beauty in music and in life comes not from perfection but from sincerity. Years had passed since the pianist's final concert in the Vatican, the night when his music had touched every heart in that great hall. Though his hands no longer played, his melody continued to live, passed from one person to another, whispered through the strings of violins, echoed in the keys of pianos, and carried in the hums of people who had once heard his music. The young woman he had taught, the one who had promised to keep the silence within her, had taken his place in the world. She traveled far and wide, carrying with her the sheet music of the Song of Silence. But more than that, she carried his message. Everywhere she went, she told his story, not as the tale of a famous man, but of a man who had learned that true greatness is found in humility. Her first stop was a small village where children gathered in dusty classrooms with broken instruments. They didn't know who the pianist was, but they listened with shining eyes as she played his music. The sound was soft and pure, filling the air like morning light. When she finished, the children clapped joyfully, and one little boy asked, "How can something so quiet feel so big?" She smiled and said, "Because it came from a heart that learned to listen." From there, she traveled to cities filled with noise, places where people rushed through life, too busy to pause or breathe. In those cities, she played his melody in crowded squares, train stations, and parks. At first, people didn't pay attention, but slowly, one by one, they stopped. The melody had that same strange power it always had. It didn't demand attention. It invited it. It reminded people of something they had forgotten inside themselves. In one city, after she performed in a public garden, an old man approached her with tears in his eyes. "That song," he said softly, "it feels like forgiveness." She nodded. "That's what it is," she replied. As months turned into years, her performances began to attract more and more people, not because they were grand, but because they felt real. Reporters asked her about the origin of the melody, and she would always tell the same story, about a man who once played for pride, was humbled by faith, and then learned to play from his soul. The story spread, reaching far beyond borders. Musicians from around the world began to perform the Song of Silence, each interpreting it differently, yet all keeping the same emotion. Some played it as a slow prayer, others as a hopeful lullaby, and some as a farewell. Yet no matter how they played it, the heart of it remained unchanged. It was music that came from truth. Meanwhile, in the Vatican, the memory of the pianist and Pope Leo XIV continued to be honored. Their story had become something of a legend among the clergy and musicians. The hall where the pianist once performed was now a place where young musicians came to learn. A portrait of him hung near the piano, showing his calm face and gentle smile. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "He played not for fame, but for peace." One winter, the young woman returned to the Vatican. She had grown older, her hair streaked with gray, her hands shaped by years of travel and playing. The guards recognized her instantly. She was welcomed warmly and led to the same hall where everything had begun. When she entered, she paused at the door. The room looked the same. Soft candlelight, golden walls, the same piano standing quietly in the center. But there was something new about it too, something lighter. She walked toward the piano slowly, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the smooth wood. "I promised him I'd keep the silence alive," she whispered. A young priest who had accompanied her smiled. "We've been waiting for you," he said gently. "People still come here to hear his story, but tonight they'll hear his song from you." The news spread quickly through the Vatican. That evening, people filled the hall again. Priests, musicians, students, and even travelers from far away. The air was filled with quiet excitement, but also reverence. The woman sat at the piano, closed her eyes, and began to play. The same melody flowed once more through the sacred space. Her fingers moved slowly, tenderly, as though speaking directly to the past. The notes shimmered in the air, filling every corner of the room. People felt the same emotion that generations before them had felt. Warmth, peace, and something unexplainable. Something holy. As she played, she felt him near. The old pianist. She could almost see him standing beside her, his kind eyes watching, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. And for a moment, the room didn't feel like a place. It felt like time itself had folded inwards, bringing together the living and the departed, the teacher and the student, the music and the silence. When the last note faded, there was no applause, only silence. A deep, beautiful silence. And in that silence, tears fell. not from sadness but from gratitude. The woman looked up, her eyes glistening, and whispered softly, "For you." After that night, something wonderful began to happen. Across the world, churches, concert halls, and schools began to hold a special event every year called the Day of Silence. On that day, musicians would gather not to compete but to play for peace, for love, for kindness. There would be no announcements, no awards, only music. The melody of the Song of Silence always began the event, reminding everyone that the truest sound often comes from the quietest heart. In small towns and great cities alike, people who had never met the pianist or the Pope still felt as if they knew them. Their story had become part of the world's memory, a story not about religion or fame but about understanding, forgiveness, and the power of humility. One evening, years later, a group of children gathered in that same Vatican hall. They were learning the song under the guidance of a young teacher who had been inspired by the woman's performance years earlier. The teacher told them, "This music was written by a man who learned that pride makes noise but love makes music." The children listened carefully, their small hands pressing gently on the keys. Their notes were not perfect, but they were full of feeling. The teacher smiled and said, "That's it. Don't worry about mistakes. Worry about meaning." And just like that, the story continued, not as a legend locked in the past, but as something alive, breathing through every note played by those who understood its heart. Outside the hall, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and rose. Bells rang softly across the Vatican, echoing through the streets, blending with the faint sound of the children's music. It was as if the world itself was singing along. Somewhere, perhaps beyond time, the pianist and the Pope stood together, watching it all unfold. The Pope smiled, saying, "You see? The song never truly ends." The pianist nodded quietly, his eyes filled with light. "No," he said. "It just changes hands." And down below, in that same hall where pride had once met grace, music and silence continued their eternal dance, reminding every listener that greatness is not found in applause, but in the gentle truth of a heart that dares to feel. Generations came and went, yet the Song of Silence lived on. It was played in grand concert halls and tiny churches, on old pianos and new violins. Each time it was performed, it carried with it a little bit of the pianist's soul and the Pope's wisdom. People said that when you listened closely, between the notes you could almost hear a whisper, a voice that said softly, "Play not for glory but for goodness." And so, the melody continued its quiet journey through time, touching the hearts of all who heard it, proving that even when a person's hands grow still, their truth can live forever in the music they leave behind. In the end, the world remembered not just the man who played, but the lesson he gave. That silence is not emptiness. It is the space where love begins to sing. And so through the ages, his story remained, a reminder to all who create, listen, and live that the purest music doesn't ask to be admired, it simply asks to be felt.